One of the most painful things I see in my work is what happens when somebody's faith community becomes another layer of the harm. Not because faith is harmful. I want to be really clear about that from the beginning. I am a person of faith. I believe in the goodness of genuine spiritual community. I believe in the healing that can happen when people are truly seen and loved within a faith context. But I also know clinically and personally that spiritual language can be weaponized, that scripture can be used as a tool of control, that the very thing that should have been your refuge can become another room that you are trapped in. And if no one has ever given you permission to name that, I'm going to give it to you now. What we're going to talk about today is how to recognize spiritual abuse in real time, not in hindsight, not years later when you finally left, but while it's happening, while you're still sitting in that room, while you are being told that your pain is a test and your boundaries are rebellion. Here's what spiritual abuse often looks like when a faith community responds to someone in a harmful relationship. First, and this is almost universal, they reframe your suffering as spiritual growth. God is using this to refine you. This is your cross to bear. Your faithfulness in this trial will be rewarded. And look, suffering can be formative. I believe that. But there is a difference between suffering that transforms and suffering that destroys. There is a difference between a hard season and a fundamentally unsafe relationship. And systematic mistreatment by someone who has chosen to harm you. When a faith leader cannot distinguish between those two things, or worse, when they just refuse to, they're not offering you spiritual counsel. They're offering you spiritual sedation. They are using God's name to keep you compliant. Second pattern, they assign you responsibility for the other person's behavior. Have you been submissive enough? Have you been praying for him? Are you sure you're not provoking this? This is the spiritual version of something I see constantly in my work, the reversal of accountability. The person who is being harmed is being asked to account for the harm. The person doing the harming is protected by the institution. And in a faith context, this reversal gets dressed up in theological language. Suddenly, your desire to be safe is unforgiveness. Your need for honesty is a lack of grace. Your boundaries are hardness of the heart. Third pattern, they weaponize covenant language. Marriage is sacred. God hates divorce. You made a vow. Yes, marriage is sacred. Covenants matter, but a covenant is a mutual commitment between two people who are both honoring the terms. When one person systematically violates the safety, dignity, and trust of the other, the covenant has already been broken by them. You acknowledging that brokenness is not the sin. Pretending it doesn't exist is. And here's what I think. God is not honored by your suffering. God is not glorified by your erasure. The version of God that requires you to stay in a relationship that is destroying you is not the God I have ever found in any scripture to date. That is a God created in the image of people who benefit from your silence. So, why do faith communities do this? Why do the very people who are supposed to shepherd and protect end up enabling harm? Well, there's a few reasons. First, they are trained in theology, not trauma. Most pastoral counseling programs spend very little time on the dynamics of coercive control, narcissistic abuse, or domestic violence. The pastor sitting across from you may genuinely not understand what you're describing. They hear, we're having problems, and they think, marriage enrichment weekend, that's what's going to help. What they don't hear is, I'm being systematically controlled by someone who has learned exactly how to hurt me without leaving any marks. This is not an excuse. This is an explanation. And it's why so many people in harmful situations are re traumatized by the very communities they turn to for help. The helper doesn't have the framework to recognize what they're actually seeing. Second, the institutional preservation. Churches are institutions, and institutions protect themselves. A divorce in the congregation raises questions. A family that falls apart publicly creates discomfort. A woman who leaves her husband and names what he did, that is a problem, not for theological reasons, for institutional ones. It is easier institutionally to keep the family together, to counsel patience, to encourage prayer, to frame the situation as complicated rather than what it actually is. One person choosing to harm another person. And so the institution leans on the person most likely to comply, which is almost always the person who's being abused. Third, the theology itself is probably distorted. There are faith traditions that have built entire structures around hierarchy, submission, and silence, where women's voices are discounted, where questioning leadership is treated as rebellion against God, where suffering is spiritualized and endurance is the highest virtue. So, if you were raised in one of these systems, what I'm describing isn't just coming from a few bad actors, it's coming from the water that you have been swimming in your entire life. And untangling your faith from that distortion is some of the hardest work there is, because it asks you to separate what is true about God from what you have been taught about God. And those two things may be very different. Something that gets missed a lot in conversations about spiritual abuse. This isn't just a theological problem. This is a nervous system problem. When your faith community tells you that your pain is sanctioned by God, something happens in your body. The part of you that was finally starting to trust your own perceptions, the part that said, this is wrong and this is not okay, that part gets silenced, not by logic, by authority, by the felt sense that God Himself is telling you to endure. And your nervous system, which was already shaped by the abuse at home, now has a second layer of dysregulation, because the place that was supposed to be safe, the place where you were supposed to be able to go and tell the truth, just told you that your truth is wrong. So, what does it look like to heal from this? First, you have to be willing to separate God from the people who claimed to speak for God. That's not easy, especially if those people raised you or if those people baptized you, if those people were the only spiritual authority you ever knew. I think you should consider the God who made you, the God who knows you at your most honest, most exhausted, most angry, that God does not require your silence. That God is not honored by your destruction. That God is not a weapon that your abuser gets to use against you. Reclaiming your faith after spiritual abuse means deciding, maybe for the very first time, what you actually believe, not what you have been told, not what kept you safe as a kid, what is actually true. And that might look like leaving a faith community that enabled harm. It might look like staying, but with different boundaries, or a season of not going to church at all while you figure out what still feels holy. It might look like finding a new community that knows how to hold the complexity, a community that can say both marriage matters and your safety matters more. Second, you have to rebuild your relationship with your own perception. And that is the deeper work, because spiritual abuse, like all forms of coercive control, attacks your ability to trust yourself. You've been told your instincts are wrong, your feelings are selfish, your need for safety is faithlessness. Rebuilding means learning to hear your own voice again, learning that the quiet knowing inside of you, the one that's been saying, this is not right for years, that voice was telling the truth. It was always telling the truth. The people who told you to ignore it are the people who were wrong. And third, you may need support outside of your faith community to do this work. And I say this carefully because I know it can feel like betrayal, but the same community that enabled the harm is not always the community that can help you heal from it. A trauma informed therapist, a domestic violence advocate, a support group specifically for spiritual abuse survivors, those resources exist because people like you need them. We need them. I need somewhere to send my people to, who come to me and say, this is what's happening. They need somewhere to go. And sometimes the support group is the exact place, or a domestic violence advocate is the place that a person needs to go. So obviously, there are those things exist. And because of their existence, I hope that translates to you that you're not alone in this. All right. So if you watch this far, let me leave you with something truthful. You did not imagine it. What happened in that room when you told the truth and you were met with scripture that was weaponized? That was not counsel. That was control with a cross on it. And the part of you that felt sick afterwards, the part that felt smaller instead of supported and relieved, that part that stopped talking about it because it seemed like even God was against you, that part was paying attention, and that part knew you are allowed to trust her. You are allowed to live in a community that does not require erasure of who you are. You are allowed to find a faith that has room for you, your whole entire self, including the self that is angry, wounded, and done pretending. So don't forget, like, subscribe, hit the bell, leave a comment. Comments help me decide what my next video topic is going to be. If you know somebody who is in a relationship like this, or if you're trying to explain it to a friend or loved one so that they can understand where you're coming from, please share the video. It helps. And the more we get it into that algorithm, the more people we get to help. And you have a hand in that by sharing. Thank you so much. And I'll see you in the next one.